Manuel Noriega was a Panamanian dictator, politician and military officer who was the de facto ruler of Panama from 1983 to 1989. An authoritarian ruler who amassed a personal fortune through drug trafficking operations. He had long-standing ties to the United States intelligence agencies before the US invasion of Panama removed him from power. Born in Panama City to a poor Pardo family, Noriega studied at the Chorrillos Military School in Lima and at the School of the Americas. He became an officer in the Panamanian Army and rose through the ranks in the alliance with Omar Torrijos. In 1968, Torrijos overthrew President Arnulfo Arias in a coup. Noriega became a chief of military intelligence in Torrijos' government, and after Torrijos' death in 1981, consolidated power to become Panama's de facto ruler in 1983. Beginning in the 1950s, Noriega worked with US intelligence agencies and became one of the Central Intelligence Agency's most valued intelligence sources. He also served as a conduit for illicit weapons, military equipment, and cash destined for US-backed forces throughout Latin America. Noriega's relationship with the US deteriorated in the late 1980s after the murder of Hugo Spatafora and the resignation of President Nicolas Adito Baleta. Eventually, his relationship with intelligence agencies in other countries came to light, and his involvement in drug trafficking was investigated further. In 1988, Noriega was indicted by federal grand juries in Miami and Tampa on charges of racketeering, drug smuggling, and money laundering. The US launched an invasion of Panama following failed negotiations seeking his resignation and Noriega's annulment of the 1989 Panamanian general election. Noriega was captured and flown to the US, where he was tried on the Miami indictment, convicted on most of the charges, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Ultimately serving 17 years after a reduction in sentence for good behavior, Noriega was extradited to France in 2010, where he was convicted and sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment for money laundering. In 2011, France extradited him to Panama, where he was incarcerated for crimes committed during his rule, for which he had been tried and convicted in absentia in the 1990s. Diagnosed with a brain tumor in March 2017, Noriega suffered complications during surgery and died 2 months later. Noriega's authoritarian rule in Panama had been described as a dictatorship and was marked by repression of the media, an expansion of the military, and the persecution of political opponents. Effectively controlling the outcomes of any elections, he relied upon military nationalism to maintain his support, and did not espouse a specific social or economic ideology. Noriega was known for his complicated relationship with the US, being described as being its ally and nemesis simultaneously. He had been called one of the best-known dictators of his time and compared to authoritarian rulers such as Muammar Gaddafi and Augusto Pinochet. Manuel Noriega Moreno was born in Panama City into a relatively poor Pardo or mixed-race family with native Panamanian, African, and Spanish heritage. His date of birth is generally given as February 11, 1934, but it's a matter of uncertainty. It has been variously recorded as the date in 1934, 1936, and 1938. Noriega himself provided differing dates of birth. He was born in the neighborhood of El Terraplén de San Felipe. Noriega's mother, who was not married to his father, had been described as a cook and a laundress, while his father recounted Noriega was an accountant. His mother, whose family name was Moreno, died of tuberculosis when he was still a child, and Noriega was brought up by a godmother in a one-room apartment in the slum area of Terraplén. Both his parents were dead by the time he was 5 years old. Noriega graduated from Chorrillos in 1962 with a specialization in engineering. He returned to Panama and joined the Panama National Guard. Posted to Colón, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in September 1962. His commanding officer in Colón was Omar Torrijos, then a major in the National Guard. Torrijos became a patron and mentor to Noriega. In a 1962 incident, Torrijos helped Noriega avoid legal trouble after a prostitute accused Noriega of beating and raping her. Soon after, Noriega's drinking and violence obliged Torrijos to confine him to his quarters for a month. Despite Noriega's problems, Torrijos maintained their relationship, assuring that they will always in the same command. He also brought Diaz Herrera into the same unit. Diaz Herrera and Noriega became both friends and rivals for Torrijos' favor. Arias was elected president in 1968 following a populist campaign. Soon after taking office, he launched a patch of the National Guard, sending much of its general staff into diplomatic exile or retirement. In response, Toiros and a few other officers led a coup against him, ousting him after an 11-day presidency. The coup was set in motion by Martinez as the leader of the garrison at Chiriqui and received the support of most military officers. A power struggle followed between the various forces involved in the coup, and chiefly between Trujillo and Martinez. Noriega was an important supporter of Trujillo during this conflict. In February 1969, Trujillo's men seized Martinez and exiled him to Miami, giving Trujillo control of the country. Noriega proved to be a very capable head of intelligence during his tenure. He exiled 1,300 Panamanians who he viewed as threat to the government. He also kept files on several officials within the military, the government, and the judiciary, allowing him to blackmail them later. Noriega also held the positions of the head of the political police and head of immigration. His tenure was marked by intimidation and harassment of opposition parties and their leaders. He was described as doing much of Trujillo's dirty work. For instance, Noriega ordered the death of Jesus Hector Gallego Herrera, a priest whose work at an agricultural cooperative was seen as a threat by the government. Gallego's body is reported to have been thrown from a helicopter into the sea. He also made an effort during this period to portray Panama as a hub of enforcement against drug smuggling, possibly as a result of pressure from the Trujillos. After the Nicaraguan revolution was launched by the Sandinistas against the US-backed authoritarian ruler Anastasio Somoza Debayle in August 1978, Trujillo and Noriega initially supported the rebels, providing them with the surplus National Guard equipment and allowing Panama to be used as a cover for arms shipment from Cuba to Nicaragua. Trujillo sought for himself the same aura of democratic respectability that the Sandinistas rebels had in Nicaragua, and so abandoned the little title of maximum leader he had taken in 1972, promising that elections will be held in 1984. Noriega also arranged for weapons purchased in the US to be shipped to the Sandinista forces, a deal on which he made a profit. The US discovered Noriega's role in supplying weapons, and through the episode proved embarrassing to the Carter administration in the US. No charges were brought against Noriega because the US did not wish to anger a friendly government, and the issue was rendered moot by the Sandinista victory in 1979. After Somoza's overthrow, Noriega continued to smuggle weapons, selling them to leftist guerrillas fighting the US-backed authoritarian government in El Salvador. After one of these shipments was captured, Trujillo, who had friends in the Salvadorian military government, reprimanded Noriega, though the shipments did not stop altogether. Trujillo died in a plane crash on July 31, 1981. Noriega preferred to remain behind the scenes rather than become president, and to avoid the public scrutiny that came with the post. He did not have a particularly social or economic ideology and used military nationalism to unify his supporters. The Partido Revolucionario Democrático, the Democratic Revolutionary Party (PRD), which had been established by Trujillo and had strong support among military families, was used by Noriega as a political front for the PDF. This party drew considerable support from low-income employees brought in the government bureaucracy by its expansion under the Trujillo and Noriega. Noriega compelled the Panamanian National Assembly to pass Law 20 of 1983, which was supposedly aimed at protecting the Panama Canal from communists and allow a huge influx of US weapons to the Panamanian military. The law also tripled the size of the military forces. Noriega's period in power saw significant capital flight from Panama. According to Kempe, this was at least in part because wealthy individuals worried their wealth would be seized by Noriega's administration. Between 1981 and 1987, the relationship between Noriega and the US grew considerably. It was driven both by the US pursuit of its security interest and Noriega using this as an effective means of gaining favor. The emergence of internal conflicts in Nicaragua and El Salvador between 1979 and 1981 led the Reagan administration to look for allies in the region, including in Panama. Noriega acted as a conduit for US support, including funds and weapons to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. He allowed the CIA to establish listening posts in Panama and also helped the US-backed Salvadorian government against the leftist Salvadorian insurgent Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front. The US spy ships used bases in Panama in their operations against the Nicaraguan government, and much of the intelligence gathered by these ships was processed in the US bases in Panama. Noriega permitted these activities despite the Panama Canal treaties restricting the use of the US bases to protecting the canal. Panama's and Noriega's involvement in drug trafficking grew considerably over the early 1980s, peaking in 1984. Intensifying conflicts in Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua had led to the creation of covert transportation networks that Noriega used to transport drugs to the US, particularly cocaine. During this period, Colombia's Medellin cartel was also seeking allies. Noriega became intimately involved with their drug trafficking and money laundering operations, and received considerable sums as protection money, bribes, or shared of profits. In June 1986, investigative journalist Seymour Ash recorded a US White House official saying that reducing Noriega's activities could greatly reduce international drug trafficking. Hugo Spatafora was a physician and political activist who had first clashed with Noriega when they were both members of Trujillo's government. Though an ally of Trujillo's, he and Noriega had been personal enemies for a long time. Despite not being a member of the opposition, he became a vocal critic of Noriega after returning to Panama from Guatemala in 1981. Spatafora amassed evidence of corruption within the government by using his position as an ally of Trujillo's to caution Noriega's allies, including Rodriguez and Calton. This included a late conversation with Calton in mid-1985 after his drug operations had collapsed due to the conflicts over a missing shipment, and he had received negative publicity in the Panamanian press. In September 1985, he accused Noriega of having connections to drug trafficking and announced his intent to expose him. The drug trafficking charges threatened Noriega's support among his own constituencies of middle-class individuals who had benefited under his and Trujillo's government. Noriega's relationship with the US deteriorated further during the late 1980s, particularly after the US began to suspect that Noriega was supporting other intelligence services. Ash wrote in 1986 that US intelligence officials suspected that Noriega was selling intelligence to the Cuban government of Fidel Castro. His report received widespread attention. Bob Woodward published a story about Noriega in the Washington Post soon afterward, going into even greater detail about Noriega's intelligence connections. Woodward and Ash's reputations made certain that the stories were taken seriously. Spatafora had also informed the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration (DEA) of some of his findings about Noriega's involvement in drug smuggling. Multiple U.S. agencies continued to investigate Noriega despite opposition from the Reagan administration. In 1988, Noriega was indicted by the U.S. federal grand juries in courts in Miami and Tampa on charges of drug trafficking. The indictment accused him of turning Panama into a shipping platform for South American cocaine that was destined for the US, and allowing drug proceeds to be hidden in Panamanian banks. Soon afterward, an army colonel and a few soldiers made an attempt to overthrow Noriega. Their poorly planned effort was crushed within a day. In March 1988, the US government entered into negotiations with Noriega seeking his resignation. Panama was represented at these negotiations by Romulo Escobar Bentancur. Negotiations collapsed after several months of lengthy and inconclusive talks, according to Dinges. Noriega had no intentions of ever resigning. On December 15, 1989, the PRD-dominated legislature spoke of a state of war between the United States and Panama. It also declared Noriega's forces were harassing the US troops and civilians. Two incidences in particular occurred very near the time of invasion and were mentioned by the Bush as a reason for the invasion. In a December 16 incident, 4 US personnel were stopped at a roadblock outside PDF headquarters in the El Chorrillo neighborhood of Panama City. The United States Department of Defense said that the servicemen were traveling unarmed in a private vehicle, and they attempted to flee the scene only after their vehicle was surrounded by a crowd of civilians and PDF troops. First Lieutenant Robert Paz of the United States Marine Corps was shot and killed in the incident. An American couple who witnessed the incident was also arrested and harassed by the PDF. The US launched its invasion of Panama on December 20, 1989. Although the killing of the Marine was a ostensible reason for the invasion, the operation had been planned for months before his death. The move was the largest military action by the US since the Vietnam War and included more than 27,000 soldiers, as well as 300 aircraft. Noriega received several warnings about the invasion from individuals within his government, though he initially disbelieved them. They grew more frequent as the invasion drew near, eventually convincing Noriega to go on the run. Noriega used a number of subterfuges including lookalikes and playbacks of his recorded voice to confuse US surveillance as to his whereabouts. During his flight, Noriega reportedly took shelter with several supportive politicians, including Balbina Herrera, the mayor of San Miguelito. The last 2 days of his flight was spent partly with his ally George Krupnik, an arms dealer and also wanted by the US. Kempe reported that Noriega considered seeking sanctuary in the Cuban or Nicaraguan embassies, but both buildings were surrounded by US troops. On the 5th day of the invasion, Noriega and four others took sanctuary in the Apostolic Nunciata, the Holy See's embassy in Panama, having threatened to flee to the countryside and lead guerrilla warfare if not given refuge. He instead turned over the majority of his weapons and requested sanctuary from Archbishop Jose Sebastian Laboa, the papal nuncio. Prevented by treaty from invading the Holy See's embassy, US soldiers from Delta Force erected a perimeter around the Nunciata. Attempts to dislodge Noriega from within included gunning vehicle engines, turning a nearby field into a landing pad for helicopters, and playing rock music at loud volumes. A Van Halen cassette tape was provided by Special Forces Sergeant John Bishop. After 10 days, Noriega surrendered on January 3, 1990. He was detained as a prisoner of war and later taken to the United States. Following his capture, Noriega was transferred to a cell in Miami Federal Courthouse, where he was arraigned on 10 charges which the Miami grand jury had returned 2 years earlier. The trial was delayed until September 1991. Over whether Noriega could be tried after detention as a prisoner of war, the admissibility of evidence and witnesses, and how to pay for Noriega's legal defense. The trial ended in April 1992 when Noriega was convicted on 8 of the 10 charges of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. On July 10, 1982, Noriega was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Noriega was tried in absentia in Panama for crimes committed during his rule. In October 1983, Noriega and 2 others were convicted of the murder of Spatafora by the Court of the 3rd Judicial District and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Panama Supreme Court confirmed the sentence on December 20, 1995. In 1994, Noriega and Alcides Sucre, an agent of his secret police, were convicted by a jury of the murder of Giroldi, who had led the 1989 coup attempt against Noriega. Though Noriega was tried in absentia, a judge traveled to the US to question him in December 1983. Noriega and Sucre both received a 20-year sentence, the maximum penalty sought by the prosecutor. Finally, Noriega received a third 20-year sentence in 1966 for his role in the death of 9 military officers supporting Giroldi. The group had been executed in a hangar at the Albrook Air Base after the coup attempt in an incident that came to be known as the Massacre of Albrook. Noriega was also prosecuted over the 1968 disappearances of Luis Antonio Quiros and Everett Clayton Kimball Guerra in Chiriqui and the 1971 death of Eliodoro Portugal. These cases had not reached a conclusion at the time of his death in 2017. The French government had requested Noriega's extradition after he was convicted of money laundering in 1999. He stated that Noriega had laundered $3 million in drug proceeds by purchasing luxury apartments in Paris. Noriega was convicted in absentia, but French law required a new trial after the subject of an in absentia sentence was apprehended. France had previously made Noriega a commander of the Legion d'Honneur in 1987. In 1999, the Panamanian government had sought extradition of Noriega from the US as he had been tried in absentia and found guilty of murder in Panama in 1995. After Noriega was imprisoned in France, Panama asked the French government to extradite Noriega so he could face trial for human rights violations in Panama. The French government had previously stated that the extradition would not happen because before the case in France had run on its course. On September 23, 2011, a French court ordered a conditional release for Noriega to be extradited to Panama on October 1st, 2011. Noriega was extradited to Panama on December 11, 2011 and incarcerated at Renassa prison to serve the sentences totaling 60 years that he had accumulated in absentia for crimes committed during his rule. Noriega's authoritarian rule of Panama had been described as a dictatorship, while Noriega himself had been referred to as a strongman. A 2017 obituary from the BBC stated that Noriega was an opportunist who used his close relationship with the United States to boost his own power in Panama and to cover up the illegal activities for which he was eventually convicted. A 2010 article in The Guardian referred to him as the best-known dictator of his time and as Panama answer to Libyan leader Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Indigenous write that though Noriega's regime saw a number of murders and crimes, they were similar in scale to those that occurred at the same time under the authoritarian governments of Guatemala, Chile, Argentina, and El Salvador. These governments never saw the level of condemnation from the US that Noriega's did. British actor Bob Hoskins portrayed Manuel Noriega in the biological 2000 American television movie Noriega, God's Favorite. Noriega was depicted in the video game Call of Duty Black Ops II. In July 2014, he filed a lawsuit against the game company Activision for depicting him and using his name without his permission. Noriega, who filed the suit while in prison for murder, claimed he was portrayed as a kidnapper, murderer, and enemy of the state. On October 28, 2014, the case against the Activision was dismissed by a judge in California.